Welcome to our very first Got Questions conference here at Celebration Church. Now, we've been planning this conference for over a year now, and even though we aren't able to host this in person like we wanted to, we believe that the opportunity to host this online is allowing more people to connect and listen in than our original plans provided for. Now, I'm super excited about these next days, and I know that you're going to be encouraged and challenged by our speakers. You are going to have the opportunity to hear from a number of speakers from RZIM, which stands for Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. We've had a great partnership with RZIM for a number of years now. And if you've never heard of RZIM, take a quick look at this video about what RZIM is all about.
Questions are not getting eliminated every day. Questions haunt our lives every day. The question of origin, the question of meaning, the question of morality, and the question of destiny. These four converge into a worldview. We all think about these issues within our own context and parameters. God has given this team the opportunity and the platform in many settings to be able to address the questions of our time. So I ask you to just get onto our website, find out what it is that ministers to your need the best. It'll equip you to answer questions, but more important than that, we hope, draw you closer and closer into your walk with Jesus Christ. And that's what we intend to do here at RZIM, address the issues of our time and the worldviews that shape people's lives.
Again, I'm so grateful for RZIM and their dedication to helping the thinker believe and the believer think. All this weekend speakers are friends of ours and of our ministry, and we've had the chance to hear almost all of them individually here at a weekend seminar over the past 4 years. Tonight, we're going to be kicking off our conference with 2 sessions, one right now and another at 8 p.m. We are grateful to have Sam Allberry kick off our conference with a talk called, Why Does God Care Who I Sleep With? Sam Allberry is a global speaker for RZIM. He's the author of numerous books, including Why Bother with Church, James for You. The best-selling is God Anti-Gay, and most recently, 7 Myths About Singleness. Sam studied theology at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. He is an ordained minister in the Church of England and has served on its governing body, the General Synod. Sam is a consulting editor for the Gospel Coalition. Sam speaks widely on issues of sexuality and identity and continues to minister as a Bible teacher and pastor. Let's lean in as Sam kicks off this year's conference.
Well, hello Celebration Church. My name is Sam Allberry. I'm part of the team with RZIM, and we are so glad to have this time to share with you over these days. Thank you for all the connections we've had with you as a ministry over these years. We're encouraged by your work. We always enjoy our fellowship with you and any opportunity we can to partner with you. I came down actually to visit you back in December, if you can remember, pre-pandemic. Feels like years ago, doesn't it? Just so loved my time being with you, and obviously deeply wish I was with you now in person, and hope this video will be, I hope, a token of coming to see you physically sometime before too long. So thank you for giving us at least this opportunity to share with you, and hope to come and see you soon. And in the meantime, message for Pastor Stephen: you owe me oysters, okay? You introduced me to them when I came before. You promised me more when I returned, so I will come down just for that. So my first topic, I'm going to be speaking to you twice during this time. The first topic we're going to be looking at is this: why does God care who I sleep with? A friend of mine pastors a large church in southern England, and his church did a survey of their local community. They were trying to figure out what are the big questions people have, and they kind of surveyed as many people as they could online, in person, through surveys and all the rest of it. And they came up with 3 questions that were just the top questions people were asking. And one of those questions was this: why does God care who I sleep with? It's a compelling question. In any week, and especially it seems at the time we're living in right now, we look around us and there is no shortage of things going on in the world right now that are pretty horrific. The news on any day of the week will just show us the levels of injustice that are going on all around us, that people are facing. We see abuse. There are issues of poverty. There are even issues with our planet going on. And so it's a very understandable question for somebody to say, well, hasn't God got enough other things he ought to be concerned with to be getting all fussy over what we do in our bedrooms in private? Why is God bothering with this? We can all think of better things for God to spend his time on, and we like to think, well, if I was God, I would be sorting out these other issues and spending less time kind of moralizing about sexual ethics. So it's an understandable question. It's also obviously a very sensitive question. All of us, when it comes to this topic, all of us have a story. And so this question is relevant to all of us, and it's sensitive ground for most of us, I would guess. All of us have a story, and for many of us, the story is painful. Painful possibly because of things that we have done that we now regret. Painful maybe because of things others have done to us that have affected us profoundly. There is hurt, there is vulnerability. Many of us feel damaged and maybe even damaging to other people. So we are on highly sensitive ground here, and maybe addressing this topic through a remote screen is an easier way for some of us to deal with it, rather than being in a big auditorium and with lots of people. So this is sensitive, it's understandable, and it's so very personal. The story each of us has will be unique. The stories will vary greatly from person to person. Many of you, if you heard me in December when I was with you, I shared something of my story then. I'll just give you the kind of bullet points now. But like many people, I began to realise during my teenage years that I was attracted to other men rather than being attracted to women. It took me a long time to kind of even acknowledge that was the case. I mean, this was over 25 years ago now. It's a very different world. These issues had less prominence then than they do now. And I just began to be aware that I was developing in a way that was very different to most of my friends at school, probably all of my friends at school. They were constantly talking about girls and who they liked and who they were pursuing romantically, and every conversation seemed to revolve around that. And I just remember feeling this intense sense of being different, of there being this whole universe of experience that I couldn't enter into, something that set me aside and differentiated me from everybody else at an age where the last thing I wanted to be actually was different. I'm sure many of us have had that feeling in one way or another. And it generated a lot of fear. It generated I now realise, a lot of anxiety. I was desperate at the time for my friends not to know. Again, this is 25 plus years ago. The world was very different. I had no doubt that if people knew, there would be intense mockery, exclusion, ridicule, and that it would just be unbearable. So that was my story. And I remember thinking, well, maybe when I leave home and go to university, I was looking at universities that were in different places, and I remember thinking, this could be something I explore at university and no one back home would ever need to know. That was what I was actually planning to do. But between that desire and actually arriving at university, I became a Christian. Some very dear friends of mine were Christian believers. They invited me to their church's youth ministry, and I decided to go. I couldn't really think of a reason not to go quick enough. So I said I'd go along and join them. I admired these Christians and felt I owed it to them to find out what they believed, to find out, more about what made them tick. And so I thought I'd go, more as a fact-finding favour to them than anything else. And yet the very first time I heard the gospel, I remember believing it. It just rang true. I began to realise that if there was a God who had made me, I didn't know him. I did not have a relationship with him. I sensed that I should. And I also sensed that was probably on me rather than being on God, that I had estranged myself from him. So when I began to hear that the gospel wasn't about God congratulating good people, but God actually coming to find lost people, I recognized something of lostness in my own spiritual condition, and realized that if God was there, I needed to be able to come back to him. And so marveled in this amazing news of Christ, that he actually came to bring us back to God. But anyway, as a brand new believer who had only just recently come to terms with his sexuality, one of the big questions for me was, what does Jesus have to say about sexual ethics? Does he have anything to say? I had no idea. Where does he land on all this? And it might be a surprise to many people today to think that Jesus said anything at all. It's very common to think of Jesus as being kind of sexually tolerant. We have an image of some people who are religious being overly rigid on this kind of issue. We certainly know that there are some passages in parts of the Bible that feel very rigid. And many people think that actually, Jesus wasn't like that. He was more concerned with justice. He was more concerned with the poor. And that he was indifferent when it came to issues of sexuality. And so we might imagine Jesus as being someone who actually is just not that bothered who we sleep with. But actually, when you come to look at the message of Jesus himself, he is not that straightforward. As I began to read the gospel accounts, I began to realize Jesus does have things to say on this, and that those things are not easy, but that they're not easy for any of us. I didn't get a sense that Jesus was singling out one particular group and giving them a hard time. I got the sense actually Jesus is critiquing all of us in this area of life. No one is more challenging when it comes to human sexuality than Jesus Christ. But at the same time, no one is more dignifying when it comes to human sexuality than Jesus Christ. I want us to just think about those two things. And as a main text for this, I want us to look at Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28. Let me read these verses to you. They may well be familiar. They're from the Sermon on the Mount, one of the most kind of well-known sections of Jesus' teaching. And in Matthew 5, verse 27, Jesus says these words. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Just a couple of sentences, but packed into those couple of sentences is some really astonishing teaching from Jesus. So again, this is from the Sermon on the Mount. It's at a part of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is reviewing some of the 10 commandments in the Old Testament. These were foundational commandments from God to the people of Israel at the beginning of their national life, and the 10 commandments were like an executive summary of everything that God wanted his people to be. And so Jesus has been reviewing some of those commandments and showing how they've been misunderstood over the years, how people have been misinterpreting them, and how actually those commandments, they go much further, much deeper than people had tended to realize. They're actually very incisive and searching. So Jesus has already dealt with some of these commandments. He then comes to this command, you shall not commit adultery, again, one of the 10 commandments. And he says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. And many of them would agree. Yeah, we've heard that. We know that. We've been taught that. We've taught others that. They were very familiar with it. It was forbidden in the Old Testament to have any kind of sex outside the covenant of marriage. And so adultery was prohibited. Sex was not permitted where one or both of you was married. So they knew this stuff. They were steeped in this. And I imagine many of them felt probably pretty good about their own performance on this. With some of the other commandments, I can imagine that they found what Jesus had to say very, very challenging and very uncomfortable. But I can imagine when it comes to this commandment, when it comes to the commandment not to commit adultery, many of Jesus' original hearers would have been thinking, actually, I'm okay on this. I'm pretty good on this. I don't know where Jesus is going to take this, but I'm feeling pretty confident. I'm feeling pretty okay. And Jesus then says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you. So he's going to say something by way of contrast to what they've heard. So they might even be thinking, well, maybe Jesus is going to loosen this one up a bit. Maybe Jesus is going to kind of lessen the force of this commandment. Maybe Jesus is going to say it's okay, that this was something for then and we live in a different time now and things have changed. We're in a different culture, a different world. These things don't matter in the way that they used to. Well, if they were thinking Jesus was going to loosen up this commandment, they were severely mistaken, because Jesus says something very different. He says, I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, Jesus would have been talking to a predominantly male audience, so he talks in terms of how a man looks at a woman, but it would apply either way around. And again, this is profoundly, and I would say uniquely challenging, what Jesus is saying here. Because he's saying this commandment is not just about external behavior. It is about your attitude inside. It's about the way you regard other people. And so Jesus is saying, listen, the point of this commandment isn't just to regulate the way you act. It is meant to inculcate a particular attitude to other people. And so he says, anyone who looks with lustful intent has already committed adultery in their heart. So Jesus is saying, adultery doesn't just take place in a bedroom. Adultery takes place in our hearts. If I can put it bluntly, Jesus is saying adultery isn't just about what you do with your genitals. It's about what you do with your eyes. It's about how you look at someone. It's about what you do with your mind, how you think about someone. And Jesus says if you look at another human being with lust, you are breaking this commandment. In other words, he's saying you are treating that other person's body, their physicality, their sexuality, you are treating that as a commodity for your own self-pleasure, for your own gratification. You are treating their sexuality as something to be taken by you and consumed by you, whether that's physically or whether that's just in your own mind. And here's why this matters. Committing adultery in this way, lusting after someone, isn't just breaking some random religious rule from centuries ago. Jesus is saying, actually, looking at other people with lust goes against the grain of how God has designed sex to be. Now, we tend to think in our own culture about sex primarily being about self-expression. It's kind of how I show who I am. But in the Bible, sex is actually about self-giving. Not self-expression, but self-giving. It is designed in Scripture to be a means of fusing two people together at the very deepest level in mutual self-giving. The pastor and author Tim Keller, I'm sure you're familiar with him, has written that sex is, in the Bible, sex is meant to be a way of saying, I am giving myself to someone fully, exclusively, and permanently. Fully, because it actually is designed to involve the whole person. The whole of yourself is being given to somebody else in the sex act. You can't just say, well, I'm giving some aspect of myself. No, actually, sex is designed to involve the whole of your personality, the whole of who you actually are. He says it's a way of giving yourself to someone fully, exclusively, because if you're giving all that you are to someone, you can't then give all that you are to somebody else. And so it's exclusive. And then thirdly, it's giving ourselves to someone else permanently, because this kind of self-giving is not designed to be undone. And in fact, it can't be undone without extraordinary and profound pain. One of the little phrases the Bible uses to describe this kind of union of self-giving is that two people become one flesh. It's not just that they are, sexually into each other. The two become one flesh. They're still separate bodies. They're still two different people, and yet something so deeply profound has taken place that they can be described, even as two separate bodies, now as being one flesh. You don't undo that without very severe pain. It would be like an amputation without anaesthetic. And I think sometimes we recognise that. We see the pain of fleeting sexual encounters. We feel that something has been taken when that happens. Years ago, there was a Tom Cruise movie called Vanilla Sky. Kind of a weird movie, not his best. But there's a scene in it where Tom Cruise's character has a one-night stand with Cameron Diaz's character. And it's clear he doesn't really want anything else to do with her. But later on in the movie, she confronts him about their one-night stand. And she says this to him. She says, when you sleep with someone, your body makes promises even if you don't. When you sleep with someone, your body makes promises even if you don't. That's actually what the Bible is showing us. That's the way sex is designed to work. That is what this commandment is meant to be getting at. It is deeply challenging, therefore, to all of us. And that's the point. Jesus is showing us in the Sermon on the Mount that the purpose of the 10 Commandments wasn't to make good people feel congratulated about their goodness. The purpose of the 10 Commandments was to expose that our hearts are not naturally inclined to follow God's ways. We don't naturally have the capacity to live in obedience to God. And therefore, that if we're going to have any kind of relationship with God, it will have to be on the basis of his mercy and his grace. It is not going to be on the basis of our performance. Actually, we're going to need God to be kind to us because of the kinds of hearts that we have. So this is what God was trying to teach his people with the Ten Commandments. You are always going to need the mercy of God. And the commandments are there to show that. They're there to show up that our hearts just do not naturally line up with how God wants us to live. Now, it's always risky when an English person talks to Americans about dentistry. But I remember having a checkup once at my dentist, and we do have dentists in England, by the way. And I remember at one point in the checkup, and I'm pretty good at dental hygiene, I like to think. And the morning of my appointment, I had brushed my teeth vigorously. It felt like for about 20 minutes I'd been brushing my teeth, and there was blood gushing everywhere out of my mouth. I was like, I'm going to make sure my teeth are really clean for the dentist. And so I was having my checkup, and again, feeling pretty good. I've been good on this. And at one point in the checkup, the dentist gave me this little plastic beaker, and it had this kind of blue or pink liquid in it. And he said, just take that, gargle it, and then for a little moment, and then spit it out. So I took the beaker, gargled it, swished it around my mouth, and spat it out. And he said, this is going to show up all the dirt and plaque on your teeth. And I was thinking, not mine. And he showed me a mirror, asked me to kind of smile, and I smiled, and I just saw this bright colour throughout my mouth and realised there is just tons of gunk on what were clean teeth. And that is what the Ten Commandments are there to do. We think we're pretty okay. We make a little special effort every now and then, but actually there is so much gunk in our hearts. We're all broken people. We're all deeply messed up people. And so this commandment against adultery is actually trying to show us that our hearts really are naturally lustful. That's just the way we are. We can't help ourselves. And so when Jesus says, if you even look at someone lustfully in your heart, you've already broken this commandment. All of us should be thinking, that's me. I do that. I'm that kind of person. And so the message of Jesus is that all of us are broken in our sexuality. All of us are messed up in our sexuality. Whatever our sexuality happens to look like, we're all in the same boat. We all misuse sexuality, other people's and our own. We're all guilty of this thing that Jesus is talking about. We all do this. So this is why I say Jesus is uniquely challenging when it comes to this issue. And there's no one he lets off the hook. But he's also uniquely dignifying. And again, this is what is so remarkable. Jesus doesn't just have a go at us and then leave us at that. Notice how dignifying his words are. We've looked at this from the vantage point of the person doing the looking. But notice what Jesus is saying by implication about the person being looked at. Jesus is saying that person has a sexual dignity that is so precious that it mustn't be violated even in the privacy of someone else's mind. Now that's huge. That person has a sexual dignity that shouldn't be violated even in the privacy of somebody else's mind. Now, our culture in the West at the moment has been significantly impacted by the Me Too movement. A lot of things have been coming to light. We are becoming more and more aware of the depth of harm that is caused by sexual abuse and just how prevalent sexual abuse has been. Which is why we need this message of Jesus. He is saying other people matter. Even in how we think about them, they matter. Their sexuality matters. And so God cares about who we sleep with. And God cares about who we might even think about sleeping with. Because God cares about us. And he cares about them. That this commandment is in the Bible shows that you matter. You matter to Jesus Christ. So it's not as some people imagine that Jesus has a really low view of human sexuality, that Jesus kind of thinks sex is kind of gross and icky and, let's just avoid the whole thing. Quite the opposite. What we're seeing here is Jesus has a high view of human sexuality. The writer and apologist John Dixon has described how we think about human sexuality in terms of how we treat cars. In other words, if you have a really cheap, messed up vehicle, you're not too fussed about how it's treated. But if you have a really expensive vehicle, actually you do care. This was brought home to me a couple of years ago. I was going to be in the States for a 3 or 4 month period and needed to get my hands on a car. And one friend of mine offered to lend me his beat up truck, and the thing had dents and scrapes and scratches all over the place. Honestly, it was a miracle this thing still worked. And I was about to gratefully use his truck and thank him for his generosity when someone else offered me their vehicle. And their vehicle wasn't a beaten up old truck. It was a really beautiful convertible. So, that's not a difficult choice. Messed up, rusty old truck or really nice convertible. Now, here's the thing. Whichever of those you have, you are going to treat in different ways. With a beaten up old truck, you're going to be thinking, well, it doesn't matter if I put another scratch on it. It's full of scratches already. And so you're going to muck around with it. You're going to have some fun with it. You're not going to be too precious about who else drives it. But with the convertible, you're thinking, man, this is a nice car. Okay, I don't want to wreck this. Now, I'm English. I was in America, so I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to need to actually drive this on the correct side of the road. I need to be careful with this. And the same is true of sexuality. If we think that human sexuality is just this, it doesn't matter, just take it for a spin, mess around with it, a few bumps and scrapes won't hurt, it doesn't matter who else is involved. The trouble is we've been treating it like that for so long, and we're beginning to realize actually it does matter. It matters far more than we thought. Christianity, in the teaching of Jesus just here, gives us a uniquely high view of human sexuality. It's more like the convertible than it is the old truck. Now, one outworking of this dignifying view of human sexuality is actually the whole idea of consent. This is the sexual ethic in the West that we claim to care the most about. We don't tend to welcome boundaries and rules about sexual conduct, except it's got to be someone who's an adult and there has to be consent. We claim to care deeply about consent. And again, the Me Too movement has shown us we don't nearly care as much as we think we do. It's still, in a culture that claims to revere consent, it is still massively abused. But the fact is, historically, consent is abnormal. It is not normally part of a culture's sexual ethic. Around the time of Jesus in the Roman Empire, sexual freedom was a reflection of status and power. The more powerful you were in society, the more sexual freedom you had. The less powerful you were, the less sexual freedom you had. So if you were a man, you did not need the consent of a wife or a mistress to have sex. You were just entitled to it. And if your wife wasn't sufficient, you would commonly have a mistress. And if your mistress didn't feel sufficient, well, there were possibly slaves that you could sleep with. And if not, if you weren't wealthy enough to own slaves, that's what prostitutes were for. But either way, it was your right to have sex whenever you wanted to have it. If you were a woman in the Roman world, your options were limited. If you were married, you had to be faithful. You were the property of your husband. He could sleep around, you couldn't. If you were unmarried, well, you had no protection of marriage. And so actually you were often regarded as a woman of shame. And so in this context, the teaching of Christianity was radical. Irrespective of your position in society, according to the teaching of the New Testament, you have no rights to sex that isn't consensual. So let me just give you an example of this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul is talking to Christians who are married. And listen to what he says. Now, the first part of this, everyone in Rome would have agreed with, particularly the men. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 4, "The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does." Now, all the guys in Rome listening to something like that would have been amening, applauding, cheering. Yep, we get that. We agree. But then Paul immediately follows it by saying, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Wow. No one had ever taught that before. That was unique. Paul is saying it's not that if you're a man, it's not that your wife's body belongs to you. He's saying if you're a man, it's that your body belongs to your spouse and vice versa. It is not about taking someone else's body. It's about giving your own body. There's a mutuality there. Kyle Harper is a professor of classics at the University of Oklahoma and has written a really helpful book called From Shame to Sin. And he describes that the kind of teaching of Christianity on sexual ethics, he describes it as the first sexual revolution. It was so profoundly countercultural in a Roman context, and it just changed everything. And he says one of the impacts of the Christian sexual ethic in the ancient world was this. He said Christianity invented consensuality. So the very reason our own culture in the West still cherishes a place for consent actually is because it is still a residue of the influence of the New Testament on our culture today. That sex has to be consensual. So let's begin to wrap up a few things. the teaching of Jesus is uniquely challenging. I hope we've seen that, and challenging to all of us. It's also uniquely dignifying, which means two things. It means there is a sense in which our culture has too low a view of sex. And we try and say to ourselves, it's just physical, it doesn't matter, it's no one else's business. But the Bible shows us it really does matter. It matters what we do with our sexuality. It matters what we do with someone else's sexuality. It matters what is done to our sexuality by somebody else. It really matters profoundly. And that is because our sexuality is connected to something deeply, deeply significant. Not necessarily in the way that we think. So there is a sense in which we have too low a view of sex. There is also a sense, I think, in which we have too high a view of sex. If one mistake is to say it doesn't mean anything, another mistake is to say it means everything. And we tend to think, well, this is the key to me feeling complete as a person, to me feeling complete in my humanity. Now, I've discovered relatively recently that the word sex is based on the Latin word secare, which means to cut off, to separate, to amputate. And the Christian writer Ronald Rolheiser writes this. He says, "We wake up in a world and in every cell of our being we ache, consciously and unconsciously, sensing that we are incomplete, unwhole, lonely, cut off, a little piece of something that was once part of a whole." There is a sense within all of us that there is something deep within us that feels disconnected. And we yearn for that connection to be made, for something to complete us. The insight of the Christian faith is that yearning, that connection isn't ultimately sexual. It's spiritual. And that longing for sexual completion is actually, in the Bible, it's a picture of a more intense longing. It's a picture of a deeper union that we are made for. It's a picture of actually a greater consummation that is available to us that can only be found through Jesus Christ himself. When Jesus came into this world, he didn't just describe himself as the Christ. He didn't just describe himself as the Son of God or as the Redeemer. He didn't just describe himself as the Saviour. He described himself as the bridegroom. Because Jesus has come to draw us into a relationship with himself that truly can make us complete, that truly can give us a sense of wholeness in a way that nothing else can. Well, thank you for listening, and I'll be back a bit later on with another talk on singleness. I hope to see you then. Thank you so much.
That was an awesome first session. Take a little break and get ready for our next session with Alicia Wood, as she's going to be covering the topic of why does God allow suffering. We'll see you back here shortly.